Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. My name is Arlene Sachs. This is Sally Ann Sachs. And today we're going to talk a little bit about why Jewish genealogy is different. And we know it is. Sally Ann, you recently gave a talk in Australia, and that really brought it sharply to your mind. Right. Do you want to tell me about that?
I was asked to speak to the Society of Australian Genealogists, and we were trying to think of a topic that would interest them. And the director said to me, you know, a number of our members have some Jewish ancestry. There were Jewish convicts on those first fleets. And they're having a lot of trouble tracing those roots. And maybe you could talk about some of it that would help us. And that got me to thinking about my earliest days in genealogy, which I guess you came directly to the Genealogy Society, but before there was one, when I first got started, I went to the Montgomery County Genealogy Society meeting, and I listened. And I heard about Civil War records, and I heard about baptismal records, and I realized this wasn't going to help me. And then the word hit me. I don't know if it hit me then, but it did later. It was all about context. If you're going to trace your family, you have to put them in context.
You have to know where they are.
Right, and when they lived, and what kind of society. And of course, the Montgomery County Genealogy Society is doing Civil War records and baptismal records because most of them were Christians and most of them had ancestors who had arrived here by the time of the Civil War.
And you're doing the local, that's the local people serving the local.
Right, but as you know, your ancestors, though you have German ancestry, they didn't come in the middle 19th century. We did have a Jewish group.
Well, Sid's family actually
your husband's family.
Around the time of the Civil War is the first one.
So you probably could learn something from Montgomery County genealogy. But for most Jews in the United States, it starts around the turn of the 20th century. Yeah. So we do a couple of generations and we're back across the ocean. And it became clear at that time that if you're going to do anything, we had to organize Jewish genealogy societies that would focus on
our needs.
Yes, which come out of our particular history and customs and religion and culture.
And therefore we really, if I think back of all the years of our society, have done relatively little on the United States because it doesn't fit most of us more than 100 years back.
Right, and then we could at that point, of course, go to the FGS or the NGS conferences and learn a great deal about how to do research in the United States.
And even the DAR has some Jewish things, but
very
little because there were very few Jews there.
Right, so the point being, you know, until the reestablishment of the State of Israel, all Jews lived under either Christian or Muslim rulers, but certainly in Europe and to some extent, and in the Ottoman Empire, Jews were left in self-governing communities. They were Jews governed themselves by Jewish law.
They were pretty much left. Well, if they were lucky, they were left alone to do the. They looked second-class citizens, but you're left alone, particularly in the Ottoman Empire until the State of Israel. I think they were
right.
They lived very well in most of those countries.
Relatively
well.
Yes, you paid taxes.
But you were ignored.
Ignored, yes. And there were certain disabilities. You couldn't ride horses.
I don't know.
But you had to ride mules. But in any case, certainly in Europe under the Magdeburg laws, it was you had Jewish courts, Jewish judges, and so the records you kept were records that you needed by Jewish law.
And those generally would be the wedding, circumcision, and divorce records.
Right. But the people in Australia, when I said, you know, Jews didn't keep birth records, and their eyes widened. What do you mean you did? I said, well, they didn't have birthday parties.
But see, that's Eastern Europe, too. But I won't go into that.
What do you mean that's Eastern?
Well, my great-great-grandfather, it was 150 years ago, he recorded every birthday and exactly what he got for his birthday and everything. So
a man.
But he celebrated the children's birthdays, too.
In Germany?
Yes.
Oh, really? That was unusual.
But see, again, that's Western Europe,
right.
Western Germany.
Because in my grandmother's generation from Russia, it was not uncommon for a woman not to know her birth date.
Because he recorded the dates. He recorded the dates in the regular calendar, Gregorian calendar, and the Hebrew calendar every time he wrote.
Well, this was a relative of yours who was a recorder. He kept diaries for 80 years or however many.
But the point is, I don't think he would have been celebrating birthdays if other people
Maybe
didn't either. There was no reason for him to record he got a tie or he gave his wife a handkerchief or something like that.
That's possible. But what we do have for the boys, of course, are the circumcision records, because those were mandated by religious law, because you had to count 13 years later for the bar mitzvah. So boys had birth records, but and of course you had marriage records. The ketubot was a marriage contract. It wasn't a marriage record; it was a marriage contract, and you had also the writs of divorce, which of course only the men could initiate.
But the point is that if somebody was divorced, the rabbi or the synagogue would have kept those records.
Absolutely.
The question is, what happened to all of those?
Oh, wait, we haven't gotten to the death records either. Well, of course, we don't have death records. We have the, if we're lucky, we have the records of the Holy Society, the Chevra Kadisha, that buried the body. And since the deceased were supposed to be buried on the day that they died, then we know the
3 days at maximum,
yeah, but by law it was supposed to be the day you died, unless there were extenuating circumstances. But that means that until the civil authorities mandated the keeping of records in the 19th century, you aren't going to find these women's birth records. You know, you can't go back.
Yeah, the women are hard to trace in any case, because we don't know their maiden names always, unless you have the ketubos.
Right, which were generally supposed to be kept. And of course, the other thing is we didn't have last names.
Yeah, well, that's the big thing.
In the Ashkenazi Jews, roughly speaking, I find it useful to think that of Ashkenazi Jews lived in Christian lands. Sephardic Jews mostly lived in Islamic lands. There's some overlap. It's not 100%, but basically that's true. So the Jews, the Ashkenazic Jews, the Jews of Northern and Eastern Europe, except for the rabbinic families, mostly, did not have hereditary last names until the civil authorities made them keep them, which was much later than
1808 in France.
1787. Emperor Joseph II of Austria instituted it. He was the first, and then the others followed at the beginning of the 19th century.
And let's go. The reason that he did that is because so he could keep track of the people, so he could get taxes. I mean,
well, actually, Joseph II decided he was going to assimilate his Jews. There was always the assimilationist urge, and yes, he couldn't keep track. Before that, it would be Joseph, son of Abraham, Abraham, son of Joseph, and if somebody's changing their name every generation, how do you keep track of them?
Well, you're really trying to get my grandfather or something, if, you know,
But since they didn't live very long, very often a child was named after a grandparent.
Yeah.
So you would see the alternating generations
fairly easily.
Well,
that in itself for us becomes an advantage, because then if you know that, if you know this child's name, father's name, and then you find the father's name or grandfather's name with the same name as the child's name, it's got to be that, because that's the naming pattern. So that, in a way, that helps us now when we're doing our research.
Yeah, I must add, though, that the Jews of the Sephardic lands, of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula, did adopt family names when the others did, around the 13th century. And then they took, when they were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, they took those names with them. So you will find some. But in Turkey, do you know that there was no law mandating hereditary last names until the 1930s for the whole population of Turkey?
No, I didn't know that.
How about that? Isn't that an interesting fact?
Well, in Iceland today, they don't have that either.
Really?
No, a female uses her name, daughter of her mother's name, and a son uses the given name, son of the father's name.
But did you read about the Harvard study of genealogy study in Iceland? Apparently, because that's a very homogeneous group, they also, in fact, keep their genealogies. And Harvard Medical School is off there studying all sorts of hereditary diseases in Iceland using those genealogies.
Yeah, but the point is their naming patterns are, well, again, that's an isolated case of
But you're right. The naming patterns are essential and helpful. You think without having last names and without having these birth and death and marriage records that would be very hard to trace. Actually, a lot of us have managed to use alternative sources that do enable us to do this, but without knowing the customs and the here's the custom that's so frustrating is that every Jewish boy gets a name at his circumcision. It's what's known as a Shem HaKodesh, a holy name. It's his Hebrew name. And he uses it at his bar mitzvah and at his wedding, and it's on his tombstone.
And it may never, ever be used ever
again, because he also was known by his everyday vernacular name, which in that part of the world was Yiddish. So today we still give our children Hebrew names, which we never use.
Well, again, to use an example of Bernard Kahn, who I have 3,000 pages that he wrote with his name written as Bear Kahn.
That's right.
And
that's a marvelous
Bernard Kahn, and that's cousin in Israel who did the research found a paper
at Hebrew University Library.
No.
Library.
Yes, that's where he found them, but they
Library.
came from like Eastern Europe someplace. I know it's the same handwriting, and there he had a different name, a Hebrew name.
Issachar, wasn't it?
Something, yeah.
That was his Hebrew name.
And it was never in anything else ever.
That you found. I mean, it would have been at his marriage, and it would have been at his death. If you had the record of the Hever Kadisha, the burial society, they would have used it. But the misery for all of us is that when these people were recorded back in Russia in the 19th century, they started doing censuses. Sometimes they're recorded with their Hebrew name. Sometimes reported with their Yiddish name. And only if you're very, very lucky, you find a record that has both names, because
you can't put them together.
Right. I'm looking. I am now back to 1740 on my Amder line, only because I finally realized that this guy who's listed on the census as Yudah was Yudah Zalka. Zalka was the name I knew.
Yeah.
But the census I have, he's Yudah. And only when I was able to put that together did I say, oh, that's the same one. But you see, reading the NGS Quarterly is never going to help me figure this out, because you simply must know this kind of information. And
Jewish people often write, but what's the Hebrew name for this, or what's the Hebrew?
What's the equivalent name? There is
but it doesn't. I've also found that you might say that's true in 75% of the cases, but then it's not a 100%. Set law that you have to use this name.
No, absolutely. And in fact, the naming after pattern is not a set law, it's a custom.
Yeah.
There are Jewish laws. For example, the whole business of interpreting records. A Jew, a Cohen, which is an inherited tribal affiliation, may not marry a divorced woman. So if you get a record from Russia that looks as if somebody's married a divorced woman and he's a Cohen, you've interpreted it wrong. You have to figure it out differently. But first cousins can marry, and uncles can marry nieces. Aunts cannot marry nephews.
Yes,
these are laws.
But you have to understand those too in order to be able to find. If you know what you're looking at, and if you think with a Christian mind, well, this is a niece and nephew. If you found that much out, an aunt and a nephew, or an uncle and a niece, they can't get married because they're an uncle and niece. Well, under Jewish law, they can. So you have to understand that. Right,
and in fact, as I think I've mentioned before, in the Washington area in 1923, a man married his niece. He lives in suburban Montgomery County, and hung up on me when I called to get some more information, because it's not anything he wanted to publicize, of course, because it is against civil law. Although in the state of Rhode Island, at one point, they passed a special law for Jews saying that first cousins could marry.
Oh, okay.
Because they had Sephardic Jews, and this was way back in colonial times.
Personally, I think an uncle-niece marriage is really too close.
Well, genetically, it's dangerous.
Yeah, that gets too...
Well, in the 2 cases in my family, in this one book, in both cases, they had a retarded child.
Yeah, that's...
And it was very sad.
And cousins... First cousins.
Yeah, well, genetically, you just become more of what you are.
Yeah.
So you can have geniuses.
Once. You know, you can do it once, but you shouldn't be doing it
terribly
often.
They did it all these years, all throughout Jewish history.
Well, that's because there wasn't anybody else.
It also was a positive good. Abraham told his grandson to marry a cousin. It's in the Bible.
That's right. Well, there's this question whether Abraham married his sister, too.
Right, yeah, it goes on and on. So you have, the other thing, of course, is in tracking these things, all these migrations that we have to know about that are so important.
And the history of the
border changes.
Border changes, yeah.
Yes, and also the draft and what it meant when a Jewish boy was going to be drafted at the age of 8 and taken off for 25 years. So all these subterfuges that were developed to hide this. So when you find that 3 brothers have 3 different last names and you don't understand why, reading the history will tell you why, and it's tremendously important.
So how did you help the people in Australia?
Well,
in a quick hour.
One woman came up to me and said, "What do you know about Jews from Yemen and Tunisia?" And I said, "You have that in your background?"
Well, there's a lot of Yemenite Jews in Western Australia.
No, South African.
I thought not Melbourne.
Perth.
In Perth, there were a lot from these.
No, there are 8,000 Jews in Perth. 6,000 are from South Africa.
Oh, I thought they all went to Melbourne.
No, they're all in Perth. I learned what I learned in Melbourne is that Melbourne has the highest per capita population of Holocaust survivors of any place in the whole world except Israel.
Wow!
Isn't that interesting?
It is.
And they're doing the government of Australia has given money to help each of these survivors write a book on their personal story. They have a whole program where they have professional editors and book designers sitting with these people and helping them produce books, and they've done several of them. It's really, really quite lovely. But basically, this the other thing that you need to know. What
did you tell about the woman from Yemen?
I told her that I had a chapter in the Avotenu Guide on Jewish Genealogy on Tunisia, and I also have a contact to the Yemenite genealogy, and she should email me. Okay. So, in fact, that's the other thing. We are a very small population worldwide. We're spread all over the world, but we are highly interrelated, and so Jews have connections to relatives. What I learned in Australia was that probably you and I know I have. That I stayed with a cousin in Perth.
Oh, did you?
Yes. How are we related? We both descend from the man who was born in 1740.
Oh my God, okay.
So it's quite a distant relationship. However, in sorting it out, that's how we found the connections. But what it means is that we needed to develop this, what I call the grapevine, or the Jewish genealogical web, because then there's a tremendous amount of help that comes from
the Jewish gen, which Susan.
Even before that, if I may say so, you found your was he your great-great-grandfather? His diaries, because you came to a Jewish Genealogy Society meeting.
You told me what to do.
I said, have you looked in such and such a place? Yeah. It's the sharing of these tiny bits of information.
Well, you said write to them, and you told me who to write to there.
Right, at Evo.
Evo, whoever was in charge then. I can't think of his name off the top of my head.
Marek Webb or Zachary Baker.
Zachary Baker.
Right.
And told me how to go about it then. But yeah, you need those contacts, and you know, you obviously know people everywhere, but I feel, you know, I'm on a much lower level, and I know people all over because I've gone to the conferences, and if somebody writes to you, you have some idea of what to do to tell them.
The other thing is, I have this standing thing that I will prove that every single Jew has a relative living in Israel. It may be a very distant one, but they will. And I think probably now also in Australia. That's what I learned. In this country of only 17 million people, I was surprised it was such a small population. There are, I asked, why did your relative go to Australia? Why did they go to New Zealand?
They went because it's a British, and they could...
Well, one person said to me, because my mother wanted to get as far away from Europe as she could after the war. And others, it was because somebody who was a distant relative sponsored them.
And for some others, it's the only place they could go.
Right.
I mean, Peter, you know, couldn't go anywhere else.
No, but he had a relative who sponsored him.
But the South Africans came there because they wanted to leave South Africa.
That's right, and they went to Perth because it's the closest plane ride. It's only 6 hours from Johannesburg to Perth.
Okay.
That's what I learned. And also there were economic opportunities there.
Well, yeah, and there's some, I met some in Melbourne when I was there.
Right,
from
yes,
South Africa.
Right. So it's this business of knowing the history that is so... We're having a big discussion of this right now on an article for Avotena with a man from France again, who's the question of what is a Jew, and are Jews a people? It makes him nervous because it makes him think of the Nazi racial laws.
Yeah.
But, you know, historically, we were a group that was tied to a specific, that came out of a specific location. And that's quite different than Islam or Christianity. So it's closer to the Italian Genealogy Society, which formed for the same reason, or the Polish Genealogy Society, because they also felt that they had specific history and needs and records that they needed to focus on that aspect of it in order to be able to know what to do.
Yeah, well, I think even though we were every place else, we never really belonged to that place. I mean,
right.
Yes, there was a certain amount of intermarriage, but still we were...
Very little intermarriage. Very, if I may be permitted a political comment, that's why everybody knew about Senator George Allen, because there was no Jewish intermarriage in Tunisia in those days.
In those days. What surprised me, though, was something that Bennett Greenspun had said, that that the men showed a consistent Jewish thing, but the women showed so much.
But if you know the history, you know why. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, and then you had the Bar Kokhba rebellion in 135 to 136, the Romans adopted a scorched earth policy. They almost wiped out all the Jews on earth, practically. And what they did, they took the men back to Rome as slaves. The women didn't accompany their husbands.
Well, they had, yeah. So
the men got to Rome, they married local women, and they converted them in. That's what happened.
Well, I think that's probably true in other places they went too. If the men went first and there wasn't anybody else to marry. And,
sure, like in Brazil and
it's just amazing that they were able to keep the culture, and because today somehow we always think as the mother as
the one that carries the
thing in the home.
That is quite amazing as you think about that the men did
and kept the kosher laws and would have taught a woman how to do that and the important things of lighting the candles and things that the woman is that's so much in Eastern Europe.
Well, it was
totally different education.
Right, but it was only 1/3 of the women who didn't match. There were 2/3 who did match, so that was a preponderance. But yes, knowing that kind of thing it's very helpful in understanding what you find.
So what else? So anyway, that's sort of why we need to have our own society or
our own. Yeah, it's the history, it's the culture, it's the religion. Oh, do I have time for one little story?
Yeah, you've got a couple minutes here.
When the Soviet Union collapsed and the archives opened up, a local genealogist, who were one of the members of our society, Boris Feldblum, acquired all the Jewish marriage records for the town of Alytus in Lithuania.
How did he manage that?
I don't know, but he did.
Okay.
And then he started to analyze them. And he was shocked to find that almost none of the people who got married in Alytus lived in Alytus. None. So why were they getting married in Alytus? Do you have any idea?
Yes, because that's where, perhaps that's where the rabbi was, or that's where the family historically was? No?
No. And he didn't know until he met Regina Kopulevich, a Jewish woman who lives in Vilnius and is a guide to Jewish Lithuania. He told her the story, and without missing a beat, she said, oh, it's because of the Sheva Brachas, the 7 blessings. And he looked stupid. The 7 blessings said at a Jewish wedding. So still Boris is looking stupid, and she said, nowadays, they're said all at the same time, at the time of the marriage. Not everywhere. I found out in Australia they're still done the old-fashioned way, 1 day at a time for a week.
Oh, so it took a...
So the families had to get up and move. If your son was marrying a girl from a nearby village, the whole family moved to that village for a week. They didn't go on honeymoons. Every day for a week, somebody entertained, I guess is the word, the couple, and another blessing was said. Well, if you've got all the family together for a week, and if cousins are marrying first cousins and uncles are marrying nieces, doesn't it make sense to have a bunch of weddings?
All at the
So
same.
then when Boris found that out, he found one couple, we called them the core couple, where one of them, I don't know if it was the groom or the bride, lived in that town. And then he was able, by looking at all the marriages that took place within a week around their wedding, he was able to trace out all these relatives of that.
Oh, wow, what a wonderful tree he could create.
Yes, but if he hadn't known that piece of cultural, of religious history, he made no sense out of those records. But once he knew it, the whole thing fell into place.
And that's just, that's the key to all of genealogy, and that's what our other guest on another show told us, that you need to understand what's going on in order to understand the documents that we find.
Oh, absolutely. To know not only what documents are created and where to look for them, but how to understand, how to interpret what you have found.
Well, I think we've covered that as much as we can.
Okay.